Thank you one more time for coming out to Bookstock, the first night of the first ever Bookstock, and we'll see if this is yes. We have another day to figure out how this thing goes. We haven't yet driven it into the ground, though there's still plenty of time. The night is young. I realized at the outset I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Paul Clarke. This is my day job at Imbibe Magazine. And also, I've always done this and always forgot to promote it, but I do have a book as well. You can buy it back there. Find me. You can be among like 20 or 30 people who own this book. So that'll be fantastic.
Can I just say for a second, Paul Clarke is an Iron Man. He has done, this is the third of these that you're doing in a row.
Yep.
That's crazy. Moderator is not easy, and I would be like up at the bar, head down, puddle of spilled drink in front of me after two.
Catch me in an hour.
Yeah,
so,
and also your book is very, very good.
Well, thank you.
So, everybody should own that book because it's a really wonderful description, cheeky history of where we are now, how we got here, written by somebody who was there at the time. So
well, thank you very much.
It's a lovely book.
So for our final conversation, if the world of drinks journalism has a Statler and Waldorf, these two guys are them.
Did you call us Statler and Waldorf?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah,
You
did.
call us Statler and Waldorf?
Yeah. I always thought he was a Hilton. But
I think we're going to find that out. But between the two of them, they have decades and decades and decades of experience doing this. But they're also some of the best damn writers in the booze world. And honestly, I would not have my job today if it weren't for these two guys. And seeing the work that they did, reading their works, reading their books early on, and thinking, God, I want to do that. I think that goes for a lot of us probably in this room who have books at the tables, kind of saw this and thought, wow, this can actually be kind of like a cool job and an interesting profession, not just writing about drinks recipes, nothing against just writing about drinks recipes, but actually stories about it. The history, digging some into the peoples, some into the cultures, and really looking at drinks, cocktails, spirits as part of this whole kind of human condition thing that we have. So,
we are kind of stuck in that, aren't we?
That's where we are now. So as far as the formal introduction, you figured out who Dave Wondrich is by now. Dave's been doing this for years. You were 15 years at Esquire, something like that? 17 years at Esquire.
Sir, I will have you know.
You can now find him regularly at the Daily Beast. And also he's the writer of basically one of the textbooks of the cocktail renaissance, or that served as that purpose, Imbibe, and Punch as well, so two of those books. And Wayne, of course, wrote And a Bottle of Rum back in 2000, published in 2006. Do I remember that right? Which again, if you're into spirits, if you're into rum at all, this has probably been your bedside reading material at least several times over the course of the last however many years since it's been out there. Wayne now also can be found at the Daily Beast on occasion and in the pages of our fair magazine, Imbibe, where he's a contributing editor. Yes. So. We want to, since you guys both kind of like dig into the history side of the equation and digging into really a lot of the background and a lot of the uncovered background, from doing this so long, what's left?
That's a real, okay. I mean, you can get all like defense Rumsfeld on this and say, well, there's the unknown unknown,
right,
which there is. Because there's a lot of shit that we just don't know that will come up and somebody will go, what the hell is that? Mm-hmm. And that does exist. But I mean, I'm trying to I used to love feedback when I was a musician, but I like it a little less now. Maybe if I lean way back. What we've got is we've kind of cleaned up all the low-hanging historical fruit on the easy drinks to find, the the famous bartenders, the this, the that. There's some things that are very difficult to dig up the history of, and those are going to take a lot more work than casual internet surfing, and that's things like history of African American bartenders, women behind the bar, things that didn't get written about a lot. They weren't as many, and they weren't as regarded. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, all the low-hanging fruit has been basically, that's been collected, is in English. Spanish is a language. French is a language. German. Those people all drank. They all had bars. The Dutch, they've had bars for longer than any of us. And, there's very little has been done on the history of any of that stuff. Very little has been done on the culture and how it fits into the English-speaking culture. And I think that's like the next frontier, is to get outside of English. And that brings you into other. We've done a lot of all the English colonialism we've done, the English colonies. But what about Brazil and the history of drinking in Brazil? The fuck knows? I mean, there's all this stuff like that, and then you get into Asia, and that's just really crazy because none of that stuff has been integrated into our knowledge. So that's, I think, what is, and we don't even know how big that is because none of us have ever really looked into it at all. So
I agree with that, especially with the other languages, and I've been frustrated by the fact that we don't really know what's going on out there. I can't do the Portuguese or Spanish research or the French research. With rum in particular, my book I really started in 1640, which is the British embrace of rum, and developing that out of Barbados, and sort of taking to the present. My theorizing and premise on that is that if you look at any bottle of rum in a back bar today, you can trace it back to 1640. You're not going to get the rum that was made in Brazil maybe in the 1590s or even earlier in India or in Southeast Asia. Those were sort of their own separate things. If you're following the lineage of these drinks, I think the American and all the contemporary modern rums really can be traced back to Barbados. So that's where I started, but there's a whole other world beyond that which would be interesting to explore and find out about. And I know you started dipping into some of the stuff from Asia from 400 years before.
I mean, there's a full description of rum production from India in the 1590s, so, that's got to be taken into account. Nobody's taken it into account because it's extremely inconvenient. But but nonetheless, I mean, it's there, it's okay, so what do we do with that?
And a lot of the stuff, particularly like for Portugal and Spain, and there's probably rum production there, except it was illegal because the Spanish didn't allow exports back to Europe, and so it was done under the table. And then, of course, the British and others would go in and bombard the cities and burn them down, so all the records were destroyed. So I don't know where you go to try to find more about Brazil or Venezuela.
I mean, there are some. I stumbled across a book, a Spanish book on the history of rum in the Dominican Republic. And that was Hispaniola, the island. And they excerpted a whole bunch of Spanish records. My Spanish is pretty poor, but I was able to get the gist of it. And it's like, okay, there was actually a deliberate Spanish prohibition in the mid-1700s where they were going out and pulling up stills and hacking holes in them and dumping out barrels. And, it was just like everything we saw in 1920 in America. They were doing it in Hispaniola and other Spanish colonies. So there was clearly a lot of people were drinking spirits, and they were homemade spirits, and they were pissed about it. And they passed a law, and they went and enforced it. We don't know any of this stuff. It was all completely new to me.
How about with American history? Is there anything that needs to be found? Does it matter if we find a reference to the cocktail prior to 1803 or whatever when Jared and Anastasia were in 1796? Do we care? Does that matter anymore, or are we done with that? No.
I mean, it's a curiosity, but I don't think it's life-changing because we already know the general circumstances of the cocktail. It's same with like the Manhattan. It's like it would be nice to find the reference to I mixed whiskey, vermouth, and bitters, and here I am in the island of Manhattan. Why don't we call it this? Here in like, here in 1874 or something. But will we find that? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of shit I thought we would never find that we found. So it's. I mean, that is tough for me. But is it? We already know the general circumstances about a lot of this stuff. The stuff that kind of interests and terrifies me is the stuff that we just don't know anything about.
And so on that level, though, like when you're looking for, what are the questions or what are the directions where, if you're not sure if you're ever going to find the answer, but you really want to go down that avenue? Because there's so many questions that have been answered to some degree. What remains that keeps you going for it?
Anyway.
It's we'll go back to rum. I'd love to know more about pre-1640 rums. Love to find more information on that. I think there's all across the spirits board. There's a pretty good base right now, but it'd be interesting to see what's a little bit beyond that. There's still debate over the term bourbon and where that comes from. It'd be interesting to find more sources on that. But again, this is it's getting fairly narrow. It's getting fairly refined, and I'm not sure how important it is. I think the thing that interests, probably both David and myself in cocktail history is it sort of reflects how we lived and how life went on. And there might be more information on that. Like a mutual friend of ours, Fred Smith, an archaeologist, who's come up with some amazingly interesting stuff about cocktail history. In Barbados, he was doing a dig down there in Bridgetown, and he came up with a house that had 24 punch bowls in it. And he's like, at first he thought, well, this must have been it. Not Brooklyn, Bridgetown.
Okay, Bridgetown. Oh, sorry. I thought I heard something in the basement.
But he found shards of 24 different individual punch bowls in a place he thought it must be a tavern, so he went back and looked at the documentary record. No, it wasn't. It was a house, and it wasn't even a house in a good part of town. It was just sort of a middling house, probably somebody who worked for one of the sugar plantations. And that tells us a lot how we lived back then, that you would have a punch bowl for if one person came over or if 40 people came over. You were all set. He also has done a lot of research in Maryland and Virginia with some of the digs there, and he can sort of trace the period of when we went from punch bowl to individual cup. So it sort of shows how as a society we went from sort of a communal society getting together and sharing punch out of a bowl, just sitting at home and having our drinks by ourselves. And it's sort of, that to me is fascinating, that you can start extrapolating how we actually lived based on how we drank. And that, I think, is just starting to get underway. It's something we've talked about when you started. There was no cocktail history. There was no spirit history. It was just considered sort of a lark and a joke. Like if you could mine some humor out of some cocktail research, that was all fine and well. But nobody really took it very seriously, really until...
I mean, there were a couple books that just sort of lit a fire under me. This was William Grimes's book, and he was a fellow comp lit PhD, which helped. And so I was like, oh, this man knows what he's talking about, which anyway, but which he did, but not a given. But because there are other comp lit PhDs, let me say that. But he did an absolutely fantastic job, in the early '90s, and then there was Barnaby Conrad III's lovely book on absinthe, which was just really rigorously sourced. And Barnaby is the sportiest man I've ever met, and just absolutely dashing man about town. And yet he sat down and wrote an absolutely rigorous book on absinthe that just kind of changed everything. It's like, oh, you can do this. You can write cultural history about drinks. You can make it detailed and anchored in actual stuff. It's not just bonhomie and...
what you read on the back of the label.
Exactly, yeah. It's not just advertising bullshit, because there's actual stuff. It's actual people doing actual things. And if you can recover that to me is the greatest.
I think it was probably starting around 2000, 2005 that the phrase, what's your source on that, was actually first uttered in bars.
Yeah,
before that, it was just whoever had the best story.
Yeah, it's
That's
not
cool.
the best place to utter it. But
Well, on that note of marketing bullshit and what's your source on that, You talked a little bit about, kind of venturing beyond the screen and like looking for information that isn't on Wikipedia or it can't easily be Googled. You both go in directions of really going deeper into source material. What are fruitful avenues? What are not fruitful avenues? And just kind of, what have you figured out along the
I
way?
can start with the online stuff. I know David does more library research than I do. But
Not so much.
You got to pay for stuff. You can't just. It's amazing when you go into Google. You say, I'm going to, let's say, research the history of the old fashioned or something, or something a little bit more obscure, and you'll just find one reference and then another. It'll be like 3 or 4 pages, and you realize they're all just quoting each other, and there's just this endless loop that goes around. And you got to get out of that loop. And one of the ways to do it is actually pay some money. You have to pay. I subscribe to a couple of newspaper databases, genealogybank.com and newspapers.com, each about $100 a year. But they're amazing. They've got millions of pages of old newspapers on there. And so you can go in there and find out, here was somebody who was traveling through Indianapolis in 1832 and they had this drink. And they're talking about it. And if you're really lucky, they give the recipe for it. And that sort of takes things off into a little more interesting direction. And for me, I like to write a lot about sort of the pop culture, what was going on at the time as people were drinking this, what else was happening, and that's a great source for that as well. David does more deep dive.
Well, I pay for a lot of databases. I probably spend in a year something like $1,200 or $1,500 on databases, which is actually okay. I mean, that's $100 a month, and these are professional tools. Other people I know who work in other professions spend way more than that, and I'm subscribed to almost anything that's useful. The stuff is actually fairly cheap if you're using it all the time, which I am. If you're using it for a casual dip, okay, but if you're professionally writing history of drinks, you should just nut up and subscribe to as many of these things as you can, because they are all useful in different ways. British newspaper archive, incredibly useful. There's Ancestry.com. I've got like their top line subscription, which is expensive as fuck. But oh my God, it's like I find a bartender, I can find out where they worked, where they lived. I look through city directories, and it's just, and partly, it's the advantage of a professional as opposed to an amateur on some of these things. I see people like writing something and they've got a blog and they can't afford to pay all this because they're not doing it for a living. I mean, for me, this is my life. This is what I do. So of course I'm going to pay for it. I'm going to pay for anything I can possibly find. I'm going to say, please take my money. Another database, here you go. But I mean, I found one like incredibly unpromising one, and but it was like, okay, that's not that much money. And I paid, and immediately I found the earliest reference to a mint julep, from 1770 in Virginia in a poem. And I was like, okay, that's like the mint julep was always considered a post-revolution American drink. And I've got it like 1770 as a recreational drink. So, shit like that is like, okay, that's why you do this. And it's expensive, but so are carpenter's tools.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, have you priced them lately? The pipe wrenches are expensive. I mean, everything is expensive. But I mean, if it's a profession, it's a profession. And I think people need to be a little more professional about it. That's my rant there. But
that's a really potent point. One thing, and you mentioned this earlier on how this wasn't taken seriously, wasn't really documented seriously for a long time. How do you separate the wheat from the chaff? How do you find the things that you go down and it's just, it was done in jest or in humor or...
I mean, a lot of it's chaff all the way down. I mean, but I mean, that comes down to judgment, and that's, I don't know if you can teach that, but I mean, and if anything that's judgment, you're going to get it wrong sometimes.
Yeah.
But, I mean, for me personally, I spent years in graduate school studying just how to do that. So I've got like a really pretty much unfair advantage is I got years of extra experience going, that source is a little bullshit, and that's a little suspect, and this is why. But on the other hand, I mean, most of it is just common sense. I mean, you look at it, and it's also, in context. You can't just use one source. It used to be people said, oh, I found this article, a history of this. bang, let me put this up, and I'm now the historian of this. And that doesn't work anymore. It's like you gotta back it up and put it in context. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to, is it's not enough to just say, here's an article that says this.
Yeah. An article, it'll start you off on a search. So then you can
Yeah.
go to other databases. You find a name of somebody or a name of a tavern or something, and then you go see what else you can find out about it. And so it's the same as just contemporary reporting. It's like, if your mother says she loves you, get a second source.
Yeah.
on it.
I mean,
So if you see something,
don't ask your dad though.
if it's something from 1830 and it's a reference to something, like, let's see what else I can find about that from the same time period and see what's going on. So
Yeah, my motto is chase every rabbit.
yeah.
Chase down every rabbit. Like every fact is, there's a rabbit running over there. You can say, oh, it's just a little one. I'm going to let that get away. Don't.
Yeah.
All rabbits must be killed. But I mean, I don't know any other way of doing it. Is you just got to be like really thorough. And you got to be really, and it's time consuming.
We'll talk about, so I know you do this more than I do, what's not on the databases and what do you need to go to a library for? Or some other
A
resource.
lot of books.
I'm going to say last year we were at Tales of the Cocktail, Puerto Rico, and everyone was like, what you doing today? Well, I'm going to go drinking all day, or I'm going to go to the beach. They was like, I'm going to the library.
I do that in New Orleans too.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's fun. Actually, I went to the library. I walked all the way out there, and it was closed in Puerto Rico. Oh, well. But
But what do you find that you can't find in databases?
there are a lot of newspapers are not on databases. A lot of books, in the extreme, is you might get snippets or nothing at all. There's just nothing. You find the bare existence of the book, and that you got to either buy the book, which I'm good at finding very cheap copies of very expensive books because I'm very persistent. Or you got to go to the library and do interlibrary loan. And I mean, for me, because I do this for a living, that's a real calculus. Is like, can I afford to spend the time to go to the library and order this book, or should I find another path around this? Because time is money. But if you're an academic, for instance, where you get paid the same no matter how much you work, then you might want to spend more time at the library doing interlibrary loan. But for me, it's a little more tricky. But there are very few books that I'm going to really go through that whole rigmarole for.
And look, I remember starting out with a rum book, but this was before a lot of databases.
Yeah.
Was going to the Reader's Guide of Periodicals, the green books.
Yeah, I mean,
going through a shelf this wide, looking at every reference to rum in there, and then
what are the
tracking
rum
it
articles? Yeah.
Then tracking it down on microfilm, which gives you a headache because it smells like rotting acetate.
Yeah, also then
Probably.
it goes fast and you get nauseous.
It's the worst thing ever.
Oh God, it's the least fun. It's the least fun. Microfilm, and I mean, also like finding like cocktail references on microfilm. It's like, okay, the way cocktail references work in a newspaper from like 1890, on page 6, at the bottom of column 3, but not all the way at the bottom, there's a little like 1 4-line item saying, Smith and Curran's Saloon has a new drink named after them, and the sports think it's Ducky. Okay. Now, if you're looking for the history of the Smith and Curran's drink, which actually is much later than that, but anyway, if you can type that into a database, you might turn that up. That might come up because optical character recognition, which is how that works, is very spotty, especially on old microfilm, which is blotchy and blurry and
The older you go back, the
it's hard. But you might manage to try every different search term imaginable, and you might manage to land that. It's like fishing. It's like ice fishing. You cut the hole in the ice and you throw the line in. You don't know what you're going to find. But okay, if you're doing it on microfilm, how are you going to find that? It's like, I got this newspaper and I'm going to read every page on microfilm. You're practically reading it in real time. I mean, there's no speed bonus whatsoever. There was this guy who he was a PhD. He wrote this book in the 90s or 80s, this guy Perry Deuce wrote a really lovely, huge, fat academic book on bar culture in Chicago and Boston. His database was he read 1 year of one newspaper from each city. And that was an insane amount of work, you know? And we could do that now in like 30 seconds, you know? I mean, but not as, he did it accurately. We can kind of have like the quick flyover and, oh, that's flashy there. I mean, we're gonna miss a lot of stuff because of optical character recognition is not good. But nonetheless, I mean, we're in such a better world than he was in.
Oh yeah.
You know, that when you had to do it on microfilm, it's just, oh my God.
So when we started this, and when you guys started this, it was, you know, looking for some answers to questions, just kind of idle curiosity in some ways, or you start going down a rabbit hole about the Manhattan, about the sidecar, about what have you, trying to find out certain things. You find some answers. There's some answers you know you'll never find. But at this point, with this kind of body of information that we have, and looking at the general interest level and knowledge level, does the cocktail and spirit history really matter? Like, where does it still show value from doing this? Not to get all existential about it or anything. Why am I doing this?
I gotta quote.
Yeah.
I go back to Mark Brown at Sazerac Company, who always says, you got to remember what you're doing is you're in the entertainment business. And I think what we're looking for is stuff that will educate and entertain people about how people used to drink.
I think
I'm
you're
still
right.
convinced that, you know, people talk about, you know, the color of your glass changes how the taste, or the environment in which you taste it, but a story also changes how you taste it. You can improve something by stories. So I like to think that by telling stories about different spirits, different cocktails, different bars, we're improving the taste and helping to educate and entertain people. So I think that's where there's always going to, no matter how much things change, there's always going to be demand for entertainment and for good storytelling.
I mean, I've got kind of a negative example is my wife Karen, who's over there, and I used to be obsessed with this drink, the 3 Miller, from the Savoy Cocktail book, because it had the weirdest name. It was like 3 Miller. How you know, where do you get? What's that from? What does that mean? What's the significance of this enigmatic phrase? And we used to mix them up occasionally, and I mean, it was basically a between the sheets variant, and it was like, okay, this is cool. We're drinking 3 Millers, and then I found out it was a typo for 3 Miler from the 3 mile limit, and it was like we haven't made one since. You know, because when it was a 3 Miller, it had a good story because it didn't. You know, it was just so enigmatic and weird and cool. But you know, that's sort of the value of like this stuff is like, I think you're completely right, is a story is important. It's what makes, I always used to, I think I said this in my Esquire book, it's like the difference between a semi-frigid aqueous solution of C2H5OH and a bone-dry vodka martini. You know, they're exactly the same thing. But one is like, oh, that's a chemical formula, blah, blah, blah. And the other is like James Bond, you know, pulling out his silenced PPK and about to like bust a cap in not his moderator. Because even he wouldn't be that cruel. But you know, I mean, it's like they're two completely different things that are the same. And that's where the story is. And that for me is always interesting. Yeah.
We'd started out earlier talking about, you know, kind of what questions are still left unanswered, what would you like to explore, but also, I mean, we're here at a cocktail books event where there have been, God only knows how many cocktail books have come out, especially in recent years, the last 5 years especially. It's an astounding number that just like wind up on our desk. What do we need? What is still needed? What is still necessary for the, you know, for the books within the next 5 years, just to pick an arbitrary number?
I think the more social history with drink.
That would be nice.
Like you mentioned, people of color and women and what their role they played in that. The research is much harder on that because there's not as much information. but I think that would be really good to see, a broader and more in-depth coverage of that. As far as do we need another book that's got the classic cocktail recipes reprinted? I don't see the need for that.
Not so much.
Yeah, not so much. Yeah.
I mean, for me, I had a fascinating research, for me anyway, research project earlier this year. I did a big article for the Daily Beast on the history of dive bars. And it turns out to be an African-American history and just absolutely fascinating. I would love to see a book about that. I mean, it's, really hard to research and really that's, you got to get into property records and all that kind of stuff. It's really difficult. But I mean, things like that I would like to see. But I was talking to Wayne earlier. A few years ago, I was at Foyle's bookstore in London, which is like this absolutely paradise of a bookstore. And they have a few used books, and one of them was this thing called The Wine Trade. And I said, oh, let me buy this. It was like £8. And it was absolutely fascinating. It was written by an executive in some importing company in the 70s, and it's a detailed history of the British wine trade, importing, how where they were importing from, how they blended the wines, which they always did, everything in just great detail and documented. It's like, do we have anything like that for the spirits trade? Mm-hmm. Nothing whatsoever. The spirits trade has been a global trade since the 1600s at least, and there have been local overseas shipping in Asia from maybe the 1200s. We don't know. I've got no idea. And I would love to see that. A really detailed history of that. Not they're histories of distillation, but not histories of the marketing part.
Right.
And that's the part that's interesting.
How it traveled.
There's
Yeah.
another
Go ahead.
another segment which would be good to see. I know you've talked about wanting to do a book, an in-depth book, but you have no time for this, on the history of New York bars and bartenders.
Yeah, that I want to do.
A lot of major cities could stand. I think New Orleans could use one of those. I know Molly Wellman's been doing a lot of research on Cincinnati and bars and bartenders there. And I think that could be, just basically breaking it down a little bit more granular. And so looking at, there's books now about how the evolution of the cocktail occurred in America from the revolution to the present day. But city by city is going to be each different story there. I think in the previous panel was talking about regionality in cities.
Yeah.
History led to that. So it'd be great to see some books on that as well.
Right. Yeah, very much so. Like a history of the New Orleans cocktail. Are you kidding me? I mean, it's going to be about 17 volumes. You're going to have one volume on the Pig and Whistle alone, which is a drink that's completely forgotten but was huge. It's just impossible.
You've already written a volume on the absinthe.
I did, just because I couldn't stop. Once I started, I mean, it was like the dog chasing the car, and I got that bumper in my teeth, and that was that jaw was not going to open. So, I ended up. I started in Brooklyn and I ended up, probably in Paducah. So, but I mean, that kind of shit is just is incredibly interesting. San Francisco, the history of bars in San Francisco. I mean, one little thing is I was looking at the city directories and looking at saloons, and in 1850, 20% of the saloons were owned by women in San Francisco. Most of those, I suspect, were houses of ill repute, which also had liquor licenses because, full service establishment. But nonetheless, it was okay, those were bars. They had bartenders there. What was going on there? I mean, that kind of thing is just fascinating, and that's I would love to see that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we want to make sure we have time for at least a couple of questions from you guys. Can we get a microphone back over there?
I feel bad about leaning back here like a pasha, but if we lean forward and get feedback. So.
Yeah, I have a question. This has been a great panel, and one of the things that's taken away is that largely the reliance on English written sources in terms of reference, right? And there's obvious reasons for that. But I'm wondering, as you branch out, in particular into some of these social areas with women and with minority culture, is there more of a reliance on oral history, or does that play an increased role or an existing role in any of your work?
Well, there are people doing oral history on this stuff. I mean, the problem with oral history is you only can get back so far, you know. You can get back maybe 2 generations, 3 if you're lucky. And that's far enough, but a lot of the drinkways we're looking at go back hundreds of years. And oral history is not going to help you very much on that.
Then you're dependent on the off-reference in a journal or something, and
Yeah.
you can't really search those like you can a newspaper database, so that's going to take generations to find all those references. If somebody starts gathering those. I had a friend in New Orleans who was then researching the history of medicine in New Orleans in the early 1700s, and she was going through like every document that she could find on there, and I said, please write down anything you find about spirits and cocktails. So if you can find enough people who will do that sort of on the side, because no one can afford to do that on their own. That takes years.
Getting back to oral history, though, I would love to see senior bartenders, retired bartenders interviewed. You know, and like just get it on record. Talk about who you worked with, you know, what drinks you made, who came into your bar. I found this online. It was up very briefly and then left. This famous bartender, Gavin Duffy, who wrote a huge book after Prohibition, was actually a very good writer, and he wrote a memoir type that he never got published. And the Irish Association in New York had it in their archives, and they put up a PDF of it online for about like 3 weeks before they realized that they didn't want to put it online. I don't know why they took it off, but I was able to get it in that time, and it's his whole memoir of his early life, you know, and he talks almost nothing about mixing drinks. It's about who came into his bar, who these people were, their conversation. They were all celebrities, theatrical impresarios, et cetera. But oral history like that is great. You know, if we could find more of that, you know, more memoirs, more stuff. But again, it only gets you back so far.
Yeah. More questions?
There are a couple over there. Yep.
Hi. You guys both did seminars at BevCon a few years ago that dovetailed really beautifully with each other about the role of journalism with the socio-political situations going on right now, as well as the history of Black bartenders. And I wanted to ask you guys how you felt about, you know, Wondrich, you shared that it was really hard to write a lot of history because it was just a footnote later in the article. How do you guys see today the importance of balancing the escapism and fun of spirits journalism and some of the more social issues that when they write Imbibe in 100 years from now, them using that as source material that's meaningful and useful, that isn't just, you know, later on in the footnotes mentioned. How do you guys feel about that now? And has that changed over time with the changes politically?
Next question.
Well, I will say just a little bit. I think Wayne and I share the conviction that you're writing for people to read, so it better in some way be amusing and interesting. I've always considered drinks writing a branch of humor writing, and that's what I learned at Esquire, and I pursued it rigorously. Even in my serious writing, I will still try to make enough light of things, or we were talking about this earlier, and Wayne, I know, is a master at this, of putting in a little aside here, a little there, just because it's human, you know? Drinking is human. It's not, and I'm an ex-academic. I hate academic writing. Modern academic writing, because if you go back like into the 1920s and before, they made their dry little academic jokes quite a bit. And I'm perfectly fine with a dry little academic joke. I mean, you know, it's better than no humor at all. And so I think the people in the future, you know, they're screw them. They're gonna if they can't take a joke, fuck them. I mean, really, because there's no like serious academic writing going on about this stuff, and I have yet to. If there is, I have yet to see it.
And it's possible to do like entertaining writing and engaging writing, having fun with it while still taking it seriously, while still like not spewing bullshit. And like you said, doing something that's entertaining, that's engaging, but also putting something in there that like the little nugget, the little seed to hang on to, because. Especially, I mean, like both in terms of what we do now with drinks writing, I just think kind of where we are as a, whatever this is, craft, I have no what it is, but where we are with that, but also where we are as a larger culture. It's kind of necessary to take the frivolous things and the fun things and still take it seriously. Don't make it overly serious, but put something in there that is of some kind of value.
I mean, haven't we learned this from Twitter that like some of the smartest people are like, the Twitter historians who are full of facts, but also full of sick burns.
Yeah.
You can do both.
Yeah.
And you can have the actual facts. Bring the receipts. Don't never not do that. But you don't have. But just because you have them doesn't mean you need to walk around in a powdered wig. And,
Yeah.
I mean, you can. I mean. A lot of this stuff is funny.
Yeah.
I think there's a story that Paul assigned me a couple years ago on the influence of immigrants in the American bar culture, and
What a great story, though.
there was a lot of human interest. I wouldn't say it was funny, but there was a lot of human interest. It started off with a well-known bartender from Washington D.C. who got pulled over for a traffic stop and deported to Bolivia. And so talked to him in Bolivia for a while. And it's a lot of human interest. And all the other bartenders I've talked to, I think there's a lot of human interest. And like I said, it's not necessarily entertaining, but it's engaging. And it's like, these are real people, and this is what's happening here and now. And then that allows someone like me and David to go back and talk about the influence of bartenders in the 19th century who were immigrants.
Right.
And how they really shaped the culture. And you can tie it all into a bigger picture. And that's, I think, important to continue to keep doing that. Tell those stories, but they still have to be entertaining and they still have to be compelling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. There and then there.
So we talked earlier about America's distilled spirit with bourbon and Canadian whiskey, and you're talking about wanting to get outside of the English language and into other cultures and things. I had an occasion a couple of years ago to come across a Peruvian spirit called Pisco or Pisco, P-I-S-C-O.
Pisco.
Pisco. So but in the United States, all I could find was Chilean, which is I guess it's the knockoff brand. I don't know. I don't know. So here comes my question.
Don't go down there.
Good. So here's my question. So that's something that I knew nothing about,
Right.
but could not find the Peruvian in the States, but could find the Chilean. So there has to be those things in the other 276 countries, however many there are in the world, that they only make there. And that to me would be an interesting book, so that when we travel to Bora Bora, we know to ask for this thing that you can only get there, or to prove that you can only get there. Is that something that interests the two of you?
You should write this.
You'll pay the travel expenses. We'll write it for Imbibe.
No, I mean, you should write a book. Because the best ones are voyages of discovery. I went around the world, and I met all the people here, and and you're drinking Ogogoro in West Africa, and you're drinking Pisco all up and down the west coast of South America, whether they call it Pisco or Singani or Aguardiente de Catamarca or whatever, because there are a bunch of different countries that make the same damn spirit, and then fight about it incessantly.
Would that help bring those spirits then maybe to America?
Well, some of them are here. Lately, maybe not here in Louisville, but they're starting to filter in. Lately, I've seen a whole bunch of Tyrande, which is a Mexican rum from Michoacan that's got a pretty long tradition. They've been making rum in Mexico since the 1500s. We don't know that, but it's true. And this is absolutely lovely stuff made in the uplands, and very bright, clean, and grassy, made from sugarcane juice. And it's only now coming into America because of questions like yours. And people have been asking that, and they're saying, what else is there in this world? I've got another like sugarcane juice rum from Okinawa. What the hell is rum from Okinawa? I mean,
cultures then want to share it with the world? I mean, would it help them economically?
some it does. Some it does, for sure. Yeah. Haiti makes a very nice. You see a lot of this with cane spirits, which have got like a new like sort of group of people who are interested in the far boundaries of that. You see it less with some of the funkier Asian spirits. I don't see a lot of coconut spirit, sadly, here in America. There's coconut. It's not made from dried coconuts. It's made from the sap, and that is one of the world's main sources of, maybe not by volume, but historically sources of distilled spirit was coconut palm wine that distills up real nice. But there's like nothing distributed in America. There's very little anyway.
We can do one more. How about terroir guy here?
This is not a question about terroir. Both of you write tremendously, and it also feels like both of you have this Sisyphean task of just searching and hunting for that tiny little nugget of proof that this fact existed. So the question is, what do you do other than drinking to relieve the pressure of that Sisyphean task?
I think the searching is the relief. I enjoy that because then when you find it, you think, shit, now I got to write it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And you can sit there and pour yourself a snifter or something, and it's like
we
clicking
get
through
paid
the
to waste time on the internet.
just looking and looking like, oh, here's a good quote. This is what I've been looking for. And then you grab it, and then you procrastinate for 5 days before you write it.
Yeah. Also, funk music.
Excellent. Well,
Give it
thank
up and
you,
turn it
everyone.
loose.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Hey, just a reminder before you go, this continues tomorrow. We've got Jim Meehan, we've got Noah Rothbaum, we've got Phil Green, we've got Amanda Schuster. We've got more of our books, we've got more of our writers. We're around, and there's more booze. So you don't have to leave now. I'm just saying, come back tomorrow, okay?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, thank you.